Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout the program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Dr. Brautigam and I, time permitting, will get to as many of them as we can. My guest today is Professor Deborah Brautigam. She is the Bernard Schwartz Professor of Political Economy and Director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies. Her most recent books include The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China and Africa, and Will Africa Feed China? Under Professor Brautigam's leadership, the China-Africa Research Initiative has emerged as the authoritative source for accurate information on China's lending to Africa. Please welcome Dr. Deborah Brautigam. Good morning, Professor Brautigam. How are you today?
I'm very well, Sarwar. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. Let me just ask you as we start that China is a leading bilateral lender in 32 African countries and the top lender to the continent as a whole. What does your research tell us about the size of China's financial lending and how it's being used?
Well, that's a big question. We have been tracking Chinese loans in Africa for the past decade or so, and our database goes back to 2000. So we have data on Chinese loans from 2000 up until the most recent iteration is 2020. And the database is now being managed by Boston University's Center for Global Development Policy. So we've handed it over to them. They have data on Chinese lending in Africa and now Latin America and other parts of the world. So they've become the foremost location for that. But we still work very closely with them. And in fact, two of my former students are in charge of the database at Boston University.
Wow.
So I just want to point out one thing, that China is actually second to the World Bank in Africa.
Yes.
So they're very close, almost neck to neck. But the World Bank, particularly this year, because the World Bank extended quite a bit of loan finance to help countries deal with the pandemic. So they're a bit ahead. So the Chinese lending and World Bank lending and lending from other entities in Africa is quite different. So Chinese lending is overwhelmingly for infrastructure. And I think this is really responding to African governments' demands and their requests. So they want infrastructure. It's politically popular to build roads and bridges and airports and ports. And it's also good for economic development. It depends, of course, on how the projects are designed and how they're going to be financed. But by and large, the infrastructure gap in Africa is huge. According to the African Development Bank, it's every year African governments have a gap of about $75 billion.
Wow.
So they're already spending quite a bit, but the amount that they should be spending to meet the sustainable development goals and to deal with climate change and to provide electricity for their people and so on is about $75 billion.
Wow.
So, and the World Bank and other lenders and those that provide grants really moved away from infrastructure.
Right.
So this was a wide open field when the Chinese started ratcheting up their business engagement on the continent. And they already had quite a bit of experience in infrastructure lending. So both in Africa, actually dating back to 1960, the first Chinese loans were made in Guinea in 1960, and it was for infrastructure, electricity projects in particular. So this has a very long history, but it's,
Sure.
of course, expanded.
But you know, I wanted to ask you, what about these continuing allegations that China's lending is predatory, meaning it prefers lending to countries that can't pay back the loans, and when that happens, China repossesses the assets that they lend? What is your view on that? This continues to, I think, come up all the time.
It does continue to come up all the time, Sarwar. And just yesterday in my email, a new set of allegations that repeated a lot of these, what we have found are myths, came out from the Atlantic Council, which is a very respected organization. But clearly the person who is recirculating these stories hadn't really looked into them.
Well,
So,
but you know, again, I just want to tell our viewers that I'm asking Dr. Brautigam about this continuing set of stories, even in the influential media, that China prefers to lend to countries that can't pay back the loans, so then it can grab their assets, much like a bank would. And Professor Brautigam's center is the leading source to point out that this is largely a myth. And that's what we're discussing. And it's terribly important, right, Deborah? So please go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
well, this set of stories that you're talking about goes under the name or the meme of debt trap diplomacy. And this idea, which is erroneous, according to my research and that of many others who are not at my center, but in places around the world, the idea is that, as you mentioned, this is a deliberate policy. And it really goes back to the story of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
So this port is one that received finance in several different stages from China Exim Bank. It's located in an underdeveloped region of Sri Lanka, actually in the poorest province, where the government hoped this would become an economic development node, that they would be able to bring in shipping, which was going by. This is right off the major Indian Ocean transshipment routes or shipping routes. And so you can sit there and you can basically see at night, especially, all of these boats going by.
Wow.
And so the government thought, let's get them to stop. And let's create a transshipment center, which means that the ships would come in and they would offload part of their cargo, and then it would be loaded for other places. So there would be a lot of warehouses. They could bring in things, raw materials, other commodities, and they could be shipped on to other places. And there really was nothing like this in South Asia. India didn't have anything, a major port, in part because India had required all of the shipping between Indian ports to be done on Indian ships. And so that's not practical for a big international shipping line to do their shipping that way. So Sri Lanka thought they could grab this business and they could do it before anyone else. And according to the feasibility studies that I saw and that my colleague Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School saw, this looked, according to a Canadian study and a Danish study, this looked like a really feasible project. But there's a big if, it needed to be rolled out gradually. And so it's not that easy to get shipping to suddenly come to your port.
Right.
It takes a lot of marketing. You have to expect to run at a loss for about 10 years.
Wow.
Even if your marketing plan is really professional and well developed. And so what happened in this instance is two things. One is the Sri Lankan government rolled the port out, the second phase of the port, more quickly than the feasibility studies had recommended. So that was a mistake on their part. They did this for political reasons to get this project up and going before an election. And the second thing is that the project was being run by the Sri Lanka Ports Authority, which didn't have any experience in trying to market a port worldwide. And so it was expected that the port would run at a loss for a number of years until they generated business, but it was running at even more of a loss. So that was the situation. The government that really wanted this port lost power unexpectedly in an election. And new government came in and they said, we don't really want to stick it out until this port is profitable. Let's see if the Chinese will take it back.
Right.
And so the whole thing was basically orchestrated by the Sri Lankans, not by the Chinese. And so that's, my colleague Meg Rithmeyer likes to say, this is how Sri Lanka got China to cough up a port. But the New York Times, when they reported on this, they called it how China got Sri Lanka to cough up a port.
Isn't that something? It's, I mean, the New York Times is, of course, well researched and so on. But what concerns me about this continuing myth that's being propagated is that, as you well know, the household consumption in African countries is projected to reach 2.5 trillion by 2030. Right. And China is building all this infrastructure, giving African countries mobility and ability to trade faster, building influence. I think your research has shown that the African countries, in fact, Africa in general, has a slightly higher opinion of its connections with China than it does with the US. But looking at this huge economic potential, aren't we getting into trouble if we don't seriously think about how we are going to, may I use the word, compete with China for hearts and minds in Africa? It's a broad question, but I would love to see you try and have a shot at it.
Let me say first, Sarwar, that the research, the public opinion polls that you alluded to there was carried out by Afrobarometer.
Okay.
That wasn't something that our center did.
Okay.
But Afrobarometer carries out public opinion polls on a regular basis. And from time to time, they have added a China question in there in a comparative context. And so this most recent public opinion poll was 34 countries. And it did show that in terms of what public opinion in these 34 countries felt, that 63% felt that China was a positive influence in their country, and that it was only 60% for the United States. So this has both an economic and a political dimension. So if we look at the political dimension, I point out that this poll was taken during the Trump era. And I think that the Trump administration's attitude toward Africa was less than positive. You know, we know some of the stories about comments that the former president had made that were widely circulated, that were disparaging of African countries. And these were widely picked up. And I think that affected the attitude toward that administration. So that was one aspect of the political. But there's also the fact that the Chinese government really prioritizes its relationships in Africa. And you can see this, for example, every year, the foreign minister of China goes first in January. His first trip of the year is to Africa. Wow. He goes to at least 3 countries. And you just don't see that kind of attention being paid by the United States. And there's an anecdote I was told by a Kenyan who said that the Kenyan Speaker of the Parliament went to China and he got an audience with Xi Jinping. Wow. And he came to Washington and he couldn't even get an audience with Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of our Parliament.
Well, that says it all, doesn't it? But listen, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit because I want to ask you, there have to be times when countries run into trouble with their payments to China. Do you have any information from your center about how China handles these problem loans and what its attitude is to resolving these payment problems, Deborah?
Yes, Sarwar, we have been tracking this, and we actually started this research back in 2018. We could see that countries were starting to get into trouble with their lending, and not just lending from China, but also lending from the bond market, which has become a big source of capital for many African countries. And they like the bond money because they can use it for whatever they want. There are no restrictions on that. Whereas money from China is pretty much tied to infrastructure or imports from China. And so in 2018, we saw some countries getting into difficulties. And we saw the Chinese doing adjustments. So for example, in Ethiopia, the Chinese had financed a railway. Ethiopia is landlocked. So this railway went from Addis Ababa, the capital, through Ethiopia to Djibouti, which is on the coast, and then allowed Ethiopia to export and import through Djibouti. But they were having trouble with the payments on this loan. And so the Chinese restructured it. They allowed them 20 additional years. And so that made the annual payments a lot lower. This didn't solve Ethiopia's problems. They're still having difficulties, but it was their first round of response. And then we saw also in countries like Mozambique, the Republic of Congo, the same kind of thing. There was a lengthening of the repayment period in those countries. So that was the first set of responses. We've also seen cancellation of a small group of loans that have zero interest rates. So these are foreign aid loans, and it's a kind of foreign aid move to cancel those when they become when they go into default or when they build up arrears. So that's done periodically by the Chinese. So there were a number of instances that we saw where loans were rescheduled, reprofiled, and basically the repayment periods were extended. And then the pandemic hit. And so during the pandemic, the Chinese joined for the first time a multilateral effort to provide debt service suspensions. And they've done this in more than 30 countries in Africa, along with other bilateral creditors. Now, the problem with the debt service suspension, it was done under the G20, the group of 20. It only affects bilateral official creditors. And for the Chinese, that is only their export credit agency, Exim Bank. And it doesn't affect the World Bank money. So all of these countries kept repaying the World Bank during this time. And it doesn't affect the bond markets. And so all of these countries, except Zambia, which defaulted, kept paying the bond markets. So that all during the pandemic, they've been paying those loans.
But let me ask you, Deborah, sorry to interrupt, but you're making it sound almost as though China follows more the commercial lending practices, that they're, banks and so on will try their darndest to help resolve the financial issues in a mutually amicable way. Is that what I'm hearing from you, that their approach is very much market oriented?
One of the key takeaways from our research is that China is, by and large, not a donor. And it's important to disaggregate Chinese lenders in Africa. We have about 30 different Chinese lenders in our database. The lender that's done the most is the China Export Credit Agency. And even that lender has, most of its lending is at commercial rates. It also has foreign aid loans and preferential export credits. In Africa, it's about 25% of that bank's lending is at preferential rates. And those are the loans that are more the officially supported ones. The other set of loans, the bank raises its money on the capital markets and they make their decisions on the basis of commercial criteria. So most of the Chinese lending from that bank, from China Development Bank and the other banks is commercial. And so this has become an area of contention because in Western countries, most of the banks or most of the finance going in from those countries, if it isn't, there really isn't much in the way of loans. So after the last debt crisis, countries like ours, the United States turned all of our foreign aid into grants. So we don't give foreign aid loans at all.
Okay.
Of course, we're much wealthier than the Chinese too. We can afford to do that.
Right.
The Chinese don't feel as though they're in a position yet, given all the poverty that still exists in China, to provide large grants.
Now, Deborah, this may not be a fair question, but I want to give you an opportunity. You've mentioned that the Atlantic Council, of all people, has come out with a report that propagates some of these myths, if I'm saying that correctly. You want to talk a little bit about a couple of things that they've said, which you really object to, and I'd love for our viewers to know about this as this report goes out.
The Atlantic Council, it wasn't actually a report on Chinese lending. It was a commentary on what the United States should do in
Ah,
order to compete in Africa. But it was prefaced with this, one paragraph repeating the debt trap diplomacy, saying that this is what China does. And
ah,
so the United States needs to operate in a different fashion.
okay.
And so that's I think mainly, Sarwar, when you see these debt trap diplomacy allegations, it is never based on research. Even from the beginning, the very first mention of this was in an op-ed. So
Wow.
the Indian pundit that came up with the term didn't do research. He just had an opinion that this is what it looked like to him. But if you look at there's a lot of research out there now on this topic, and everyone who looks into it finds that there's actually no there there.
It's I should mention that I mean I'm in total agreement with you and so on because when I wrote my book on China's grand strategy 3-4 years ago, I actually had a look at that contract that you referred to between the Sri Lankan and the Chinese, and your research is so marvelous on that whole issue. It just surprises me how this thing just propagates. But I wanted to, as we head towards the magic time mark here, obviously with this kind of potential, I mean, I read somewhere that Nigeria alone in Africa will have a larger population than the United States consumption. And we're missing this opportunity. So now, do you think it is at all possible that a major American initiative will start, giving the debt financing during the pandemic, which was necessary, and now the huge amount of loans to give Ukraine a chance to defend itself against the invasion by Russia? I mean, it sounds like putting a lot of money into a China initiative to take on China, who's been doing it for decade or more, that it's just not in the cards in the short term. What do you think?
I think where we have a comparative advantage is in investment, and we have some experience in bringing the private sector in, for example, in the power sector. So this is something that can be shaped and fostered by the U.S. government, and I think we're trying to do that. We tried to do it through Power Africa, which was an initiative started by the Obama administration, and then in the Prosper Africa, which was a parallel initiative started by the Trump administration. The whole point of these is really bringing in equity investment from the American private sector, and it's challenging because the private sector really regards African countries and the region as highly risky. And many people who work closely on Africa have pointed out that this risk perception is not necessarily reflecting the actual situation. So
Hmm.
that's something where our government can help reduce the risk perception and perhaps use blended finance by putting some grants in to make the cost of capital lower
Right.
so that American companies can come in. But before we leave, Sarwar, I do want to point out one of the problems that I see with Chinese finance. And this is that China has a law at home that makes foreign corruption illegal. We have a law like that. It's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And most of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, most of those countries have a similar law, and they enforce it to a greater or lesser extent. The Chinese have never given any indication of enforcing their law against foreign corrupt practices. And this really does give their companies an unfair advantage over other countries where those laws are enforced. So I want to put that out there that the Chinese could do a much better job. They could start enforcing their own laws about foreign corruption. I think this would be helpful.
Well, that's a really important point, isn't it? The unfair advantage issue that you bring out. And so do I understand that if you were advising policymakers today, looking ahead to Africa, that you would really focus on making investments that do a lot with not as much money, because there is residual goodwill and quality of American help and so on, and we are a very large market. So just a few words before we run out of time.
I think we can actually learn from the French. And what I see happening with the French is
My
that
gosh, that's almost a sin in Washington to learn from the French.
well, the French have a lot of experience in Africa, and the Chinese are learning from the French. And what French and Chinese companies are doing is partnering. And so the French understand the business environment in particularly the French-speaking countries, and they have the upper end of the business scale. For example, in doing a port, the French understand about port management, and they understand about the upper level design and engineering. And so they're partnering with Chinese companies, which are still at the lower level of doing the construction. And so we can see this also in terms of public-private partnerships, these roads, toll roads. So the French are operating the toll roads and the Chinese are maintaining them. So these kinds of partnerships have been developing. I think we could learn by being open to things like that or fostering them.
Well, nice positive way to end this conversation with you, Professor Brautigam. I hope you will come back and see Polaris live again. And thank you so very much for taking the time to come this morning.
Thank you for having me, Sarwar. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that's all the time we have for this conversation. And I hope you've learned as much as I have. It was a PhD in African lending and assistance. I want to thank our viewers from around the world for supporting us and for watching these episodes of US and China in the world. Please join us again for the next episode as we continue on this journey. And until then, goodbye.